Greetings and welcome to the next episode of the Sharpen Up podcast. I'm JC Bruce, your host, with my co-host, Ron Rollins. How's it going, Ron?
Hey, Jeff, what's up?
Well, as usual, the weather is lovely down here in Florida.
I will match you weather for weather. Last time I believe we did this, it was like nasty in Ohio. It is actually 65 degrees and sunny out there. There's
Well,
kids walking around in shorts and t-shirts, joggers, acting like it's July. It's great. Yeah.
marvelous, marvelous.
I can only imagine what they're doing up at the UD campus. They're probably playing frisbee in the nude up there. It's such a nice day. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah, right. So today I think it's your turn to tee up a topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, anybody who might be listening to this, I'm wondering, like, okay, like, what do these two guys have in common? Well, we've already mentioned we worked together and we're friends and stuff. But one thing that we have in common is that somehow the fates have had each of us living for a good part of our lives in the same three states, Ohio, Texas, and Florida, which I think is kind of fun, mostly because all of those places, or at least Florida, figures seriously into the Alexander Strange books that you've got, that I see up on the shelf behind you there. He's currently based in Florida now, but he's made some travels around the country as well. I thought it'd be kind of fun to talk about, first of all, a little bit of the stuff we mentioned last time around about what it is about Florida and also about Texas that makes them such rich literary landscape terrain, and also why Ohio isn't, because Ohio does not have as much going on for an author to set books here, stories here, as Texas and Florida. At least I don't think so. There are some who have. We can talk about them, but I mean, you're down in Florida and you picked it as your milieu. What do you think?
Well, just sidetracking to the Ohio question for a moment, the author Bill Rohrbach, who used to teach the creative writing program at Ohio State, actually opined some on that, and about sort of Ohio being kind of flat for the most part, where it got leveled by the glaciers,
Right.
and it's farm country. So you have, sort of a culture there of people who have been, nose to the grindstone, hardworking people. I think probably fairly typical of the Midwest, and that's not exactly exotic. I mean, it's essential and it's worthwhile and it's all very good, but it's not exactly the same kind of exotic surroundings as you would think of in the Old West with cowboys and horses and cattle drives, or down in Florida. I'm not sure what we have here: panthers and alligators and shoot on sight laws. Oh wait, no, they're not shoot on sight laws. They're
actually in Ohio, if they haven't changed the law yet, they're about to change it. You don't even need a CCW license to carry a gun in Ohio anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived for a while in Arizona, and when we first moved there, it was fairly alarming because people were like riding their bicycles with hunting rifles strapped over their backs and walking into grocery stores with sidearms, not concealed carry. I mean, just like the Old West, sidearms on.
Right.
And the first few times you encounter something like that, it is a little alarming if you come from, well, hell, I came from Texas when I went to Arizona, and Texas does not allow that, or at least it didn't allow that when I lived there.
Yeah, I wonder if that's changed or not.
And I don't know. But Alexander Strange, actually, his roots are in Ohio. I mean, his family was from the Cincinnati area. Actually, the whole, his mother and his uncle's family was from there. And their parents had lived not far from Cincinnati and worked at in Fernald, Ohio. We all remember Fernald.
Yes.
Right. All the uranium sludge pits. And,
right.
It used to be that it was called the National Lead Company of Ohio, which was supposed to trick the Russians into thinking it was something besides a place where they processed uranium for hydrogen bombs. I don't know that was an effective trick, But I do remember as a kid growing up near there that we all had to hide under our desks during nuclear drills because that would be one of the first places the Russians would bomb. So
Absolutely.
interesting timing on that as we sit here having this podcast, and Vladimir Putin is, put his nuclear forces on high alert. So
Whatever
funny
that
thing,
means. Yeah.
how much things change, they remain the same, right?
Well, the nice part about that is for us is that Fernald isn't, as you described it, is no longer there. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
what sitting here in Dayton area, though. I mean, Dayton had a huge part in the Manhattan Project back during the 40s and 50s,
right.
and the Mound Laboratories in Miamisburg, a number of buildings in downtown Dayton and in suburban Oakwood, not too far from where I'm sitting, were all part of the lab research and work that went into the atomic bomb in the 40s. And yep, yep. A little maybe for people who live in Dayton kind of know that, but if you don't live here, you might just think, oh, the Wright brothers. But no, all that scientific innovation lasted well into the 50s and 60s here. So
Well, that's, I'm glad you brought up the Wright brothers, though. I mean, there's a popular misconception that somehow North Carolina, Kitty Hawk specifically, was
don't
the
get me
birthplace of
started.
aviation, but we both know nothing could be further from the truth.
That could
The
be a whole
airplane was
future. Yeah,
invented in Dayton, Ohio. It was not
yep,
invented in Kitty Hawk. They just had some beach and it was convenient to
correct.
test fly it on. But
Right.
aviation's began in a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. So let's
Which
just set the record
which
straight on that.
which unfortunately now is in Michigan because Orville let Henry Ford take it up to was it Greenfield Village up there, the History Museum in Detroit, the original the no, not the cycle shop. Wait, I might have that wrong. The Wright brothers' house is up in Detroit. I believe the main cycle shop is up there too. But there's only one of them left in Dayton of the cycle shops. They had like 7 of them where they did the work, 6 or 7, and there's one that still stands. So, well, that's the way it is. We could do a whole podcast on the Wright brothers,
We
but
can do
not
the
today.
podcast on the Wright brothers if you want to.
We should.
Yeah.
I should sharpen up on my Wright brothers skills.
Okay.
First,
Yeah. Sharpen up on that. But yeah. So the whole Alexander Strange's family was from the Cincinnati area. They ended up in Phoenix. He ended up there by way of Texas. He was his mother, Alice, was basically a drug addict. They basically did a lot of couch surfing. Poor Alexander never really knew a real home until shortly before his mom died. She drowned in a cave outside of Austin, trying to save an endangered species of spider, and got caught up in a flash flood. Yep. So his uncle.
Backstory, that's all. That backstory is in the first book.
That backstory is it is certainly in the first book. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes, and it gets referenced from time to time. So poor little Alexander, he gets orphaned. His uncle takes him in, and the next thing you know, he's in Phoenix. But then he makes his way back to Texas to go to college when he gets older at the University of Texas, where he was on the swim team, and then back to Arizona after graduation, where he got his first job at the Phoenix Daily Sun. But then when the Phoenix Daily Sun folded, like so many newspapers have folded, a whole bunch of ex-employees of the newspaper decided to start an online news service called Tropic Press. And he didn't want to hang out in Arizona anymore. So his uncle Leo said, well, you can come live on my houseboat, which is docked in a little island town of Goodland outside of Naples, Florida. And that's where Alexander moved to. He lives on that trawler now. In fact, it's about 40 minutes from where I live. And
coincidental. Imagine that.
Well, it is. It is. And it was. I didn't know Alexander all that well when we worked together in Phoenix, but he's a pretty decent guy, younger than me by quite a few years. He's actually only in his early 30s now. When he was still in his 20s when he worked at the newspaper in Phoenix, and so he lives aboard this fishing trawler. It's a converted fishing trawler. in this little ramshackle town. Have you been to Goodland, Ron? I'm trying to remember. You
I have not been to Goodland. We have
okay?
been to your place in Naples, but not in Goodland.
Yeah, yeah,
You took us to the swanky part of Naples.
I did. Yeah,
Yeah,
which is Naples. But
which is
yeah, the Goodland
very
is
swanky too. Yeah.
yeah, but Goodland is just the opposite of that. It's
Okay.
yeah, it's he lives right in a little marina next to a bar called Stan's Idle Hour. And on the weekends, it's
Okay.
filled up with Harleys and people in cowboy hats, and it's a wonderful outdoor honky tonk.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And
So,
so
but that's not far from where you lived as a kid. You lived in Tampa,
I was in
about two
Tampa.
hours up the road, right?
Yes, I lived in Tampa when I was sec for second, third, and fourth grade in Tampa, right off Candy Boulevard. My dad was in the Air Force at MacDill, and I have really good memories of Tampa. I mean, I have a kid's memories of Tampa, but I remember, I remember a lot about living there. Nice little ranch house. Remember, we had a couple hurricanes every year, and we had the Gasparilla Parade downtown, and
Mhm.
we had Clearwater Beach and Ybor City, and yeah, I went onto the base a lot. And when we were little kids, we used to love it. We'd go through the gates and we'd get saluted by the airman at the gate because dad had an officer's sticker in the front of the car, and when we were little kids, we thought that was really cool. And we'd salute back, and make them laugh. And yeah, we had a really good time. Lived in Texas. I've lived in Texas 3 times actually, because back to dad being in the Air Force, we lived in San Antonio twice when I was we taught like before I remember anything, and then kindergarten and first grade. So some of my earliest memories are in San Antonio, and then lived in Wichita Falls, Texas, way up on the Red River before we moved to Dayton. So that would have been 84 to 86. And we liked Texas. Texas was a blue state when we lived there, actually. Um, it's not Texas today. It was the governor and both houses of the legislature, or the ledge as they like to call it there, were Democrat, and they were not like East Coast Democrats. They were, as you know, Texas Democrats. So
They were
they had
Dixiecrats.
yeah, I mean, very big on social welfare and education and immigrant rights and stuff, but they all loved guns. There's nothing like them in Ohio. It was very interesting to go down into Texas and experience that lifestyle change. But there is something about Texas that's a little bit about like what you were saying about Florida. It's very fertile ground for you know a writer to plant a plot and grow interesting characters and move things along. And
Yeah, I lived in Austin for about 12 years.
mm,
And during the time that I lived in Texas, and this is way back when, I mean, dinosaurs had just been rendered extinct. And the very first upright humans were making their way around the planet when I lived in Austin. And it was a marvelous place, a marvelous city. And of
you're
course,
saying it was a Republican state then, is what you're saying?
well, I'm saying
No,
Austin
well, sorry,
especially
I shouldn't
was
have done. I shouldn't
a
have done that.
very, very liberal enclave then,
Right.
as it is now. But there was something during my time there about living in Texas that I don't know exactly as a stuff of legend or exactly what it is, but the whole mystique of being part of the Lone Star State back then, anyway, had a certain aura to it. There was a certain sense of cool about it, a sense that, Texas was an independent nation, a republic before it joined with the United States. You have all this, you can decide whether or not you think it's pleasant history or unpleasant history related to the Alamo and Davy Crockett and cattle drives and, all of this other stuff, the stuff of Hollywood movies. And it was, and Austin itself, of course, was a big outlaw music center. I mean, Waylon and Willie and all kinds of marvelous music was being made there and is still being made there today. But it was kind of a small town. It was certainly a much smaller town than it is now. And there's sort of a romance about being in Texas. I don't know that if I moved back there now, I would feel the same way, because I think,
Right.
the politics and everything else about Texas has changed a great deal, as it has every place else. I mean, I'm a native Floridian. I was born in Miami, and the Miami of my childhood is nothing at all like the Miami
Right.
of today. Uh,
And
so
you
I
lived
mean,
in
things
Tampa. You
change.
lived in Tampa too, right? You went to college in
I,
Tampa, right?
I did. I went to the University of South Florida for a time.
Mhm.
I did several years there, and then, in fact, I didn't live. I lived very close to where you grew up, a
Mhm.
little bit north of Gandy Boulevard. The area you grew up in was called Rattlesnake, right? I mean, some people used
Yes.
to call it, and there was a reason
Yeah.
for that.
Yes,
I
there
mean,
was.
yeah. In fact, one
We
of
had coral snakes too.
coral
Yeah.
snakes are, yeah,
Yeah.
they're not to be messed with.
But
But
they're
we
very
had
pretty. Yeah.
They are very pretty. Yeah,
Yes.
red and yellow will mess up
Yeah.
a fellow. But that was where I got my first job. I was still a student at the University of South Florida, and I
Ah,
got my first job as a copy boy, a term I don't think it's used anymore.
no.
Um, and within a few months, I was promoted to reporter while I was still a student at the university. And one of my very first beats, oddly enough, was to cover MacDill Air Force Base. So I think you were
Oh,
long
really?
gone by then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we would have been there 1968, 69, and into 70, maybe 67 to 70. So,
Actually, I might have been covering MacDill Air Force Base when you were there.
yeah. And Dad was a flight surgeon, so he had to do time. He had to do a couple hours in the belly of a B-52 to get his flight hours.
Hmm.
But for the most part, he was no OB/GYN. He was mostly, delivering babies. And but he liked we liked Florida. It was, I mean, I have great memories of growing up there. And
One of covering MacDill was a lot of fun. I spent a week down in Vieques Island off of Puerto Rico for war games down there.
oh
The
goodness.
MacDill was involved in, and they had a wonderful parachute club on the base, and they agreed to let. I was When I was a young reporter, I was also a photographer, so I did a lot of photography for the paper as well. And another reporter on the staff, a woman by the name of Margie Sisk, and I were invited to participate with the parachute club, go through all the training, jump off the tower, do everything else you have to do,
Mhm.
and then go up with the parachute club. And she was going to write a story about it, and my job was to photograph it as we were all jumping out of airplanes and doing all this stuff.
That's
And
cool.
at the last minute, the brass at MacDill Air Force Base says, "No, you guys can't jump out of the plane because our insurance won't cover it." But they let us fly up with the guys,
Right.
and I got all these wonderful pictures of everybody on the plane getting ready for their jumps and leaping
Oh
out
yeah.
the door. But sadly, we did not get to go with them. So
Well, it's when you say that, I just recalled a long buried childhood memory. I mean, when you're a little kid, you don't know too much about what your parents do as adults or at work or anything like that, right? I mean, but I have a very distant memory of Dad coming home from work one day, very upset, and he was talking with Mom, and Mom explained, we were wondering what was wrong with Dad, and she told us that had been a someone at the base who's died in a parachuting accident, and it had been his
mm,
job to tell the widow at the hospital about the fatality, and that he, as an OB/GYN, even though he did emergency room work as part of his, you know, uh, round, or I'm sure he was rotated into it, I believe, since he was a surgeon. He didn't have to deliver bad news of family deaths very often, and he was a young guy, and I remember him being very unhappy and upset about it. And I have not thought of that memory in years until you just said
wow,
parachute club in MacDill. So I don't know the details beyond that, but we all felt bad for Dad. It was very sad, but
yeah, yeah.
yeah. You mentioned the cattle drives in Texas. When we lived in Texas, my experience with that legend would have been that Larry McMurtry was Lonesome Dove was published while we lived in Wichita Falls, and he grew up in Archer City, just south of there, in the next county down was where he lived and had his famous huge, 3 city block bookstore that he maintained until the day he died, not too long ago. And I met him at a book signing when in Wichita Falls when the book came out. It was really funny because it was such a huge book in Texas, of course, but when I was reading it when I took my job at the Dayton Daily News, and all of the editors that I worked for and reported to in Dayton were like reading the book, and they were like, "You met Larry McMurtry?" And of course, I made it out to be a lot more than it was. Like, yeah, I met him in a line at a book signing. My wife interviewed him. Actually, Amy did a story on the City magazine that the newspaper published about Wichita Falls lifestyle news, and had a really nice long interview with Larry McMurtry. And they ate the new guys that I worked with ate that up. They couldn't wait to talk to her about it. So she had this special glow. She interviewed Larry McMurtry, and they're like, I mean, they were like chewing through, Lonesome Dove like it was the greatest book ever written, which it might be one of the greatest books ever written. But
I have told many, many people that, in my humble opinion, I think Lonesome Dove is probably the greatest American book.
it might be. It's certainly in the top 10, if not, and maybe that's a whole nother podcast, but oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's funny because people are still discovering it. My nephew who lives here in town, who's in his, he's maybe 25 now, and recently read it just a year or two ago. And he was like, "Why didn't you tell me to read this book?" And I was like, "I didn't know you hadn't read it." And he loved it.
Yeah.
So it's still, we rewatched the miniseries not too long ago because it was on. And Amy's like calling from, it's like, Lonesome Dove is on. Lonesome Dove is on. I'm
Well,
taking
I'm
it,
glad you
Larry.
brought that up, because I was going to ask you, in my opinion, you and I have talked a lot about, books and movies, and, who gets it right, who doesn't. And more often than not, they don't get it right when they take a really
Right.
terrific book and try to make a movie out of it. And I really thought they did a great job with that.
Oh, they did a
I
great
thought
job.
that miniseries really did it justice.
Well, it was the mini series is something that young people today who are used to TV serials and mini series and stuff don't really remember, I think, the miniseries as it was when it was created in the 70s, like, Roots and Shogun and Lonesome Dove. I mean, they were events in the way that in the pre-streaming era, it was appointment television, right? I mean,
Right.
it wasn't like, okay, yeah, well, yeah, okay, there's, we're on season 3 of Euphoria, or whatever season we're on. It's not like it wasn't like that back then. You had like basically 5, 6, 7 nights in a row of 2 hours of this show, and it was a big deal. You didn't miss it, and yeah, it was a whole different kind of viewing and watching experience. And that book weighs in around 900 pages. You couldn't have done it in a 2-hour movie or even a 3-hour movie.
Right. A regular
There's
movie would have not done it
Yeah,
justice. You just really
no,
would not have had enough time to do it.
yeah, you needed 14 hours of TV to do it.
Yeah.
And also too, that was the time TV was changing back then, because TV, the difference between TV and movies was very distinct back then in a way that it's not now. And an experience like Lonesome Dove, which was a high quality movie caliber production that was made to show on TV and be consumed like a TV show, was still a fairly new thing. It was kind of a new idea, and it was, which is kind of what added to the specialness of it, right? You had big screen actors, Robert Duvall and others who moved from the movie screen to the little TV screen. And while that's not a big deal anymore, it was a very big deal back in the 80s and early 90s still, and probably right up until The Sopranos came along, what, 10, 15 years after that. But we could probably do a whole podcast on The Sopranos too, which
Well,
again,
we could.
we got some young friends recently rediscovering it who had never watched it. And they were like, "Why didn't you tell me about this?" I'm like, "Thought I did." Would you have listened if I had? But anyway.
So Wichita Falls, where you were living, and you were working there at the newspaper, right?
Yeah, the time I was the young city editor at the Record News. Yep,
At
a
the
morning
Wichita,
paper of
yeah,
about
yeah.
about
So my
36,000
wife
circulation. Yeah,
was born not far from there, and that's where her parents retired to in Nocona, Texas.
Nocona. That was in our coverage area.
Yep. In
Yeah,
fact,
yeah.
if you we were up in Nocona many, many times visiting your folks, and after a few hours of Nocona, you've pretty much seen Nocona.
Yeah,
The greater Nocona area does not take that
right.
much time to experience in all its fullness. And so for a road trip, just for a change of scenery, we'd hop over to Wichita Falls. And
Yep.
so Wichita Falls was kind of like, a big stop. When you live in Nocona, that's where you go for a big time.
Well, a funny thing about Wichita Falls is even though it's not a huge city, it's only like about 130,000 people. It's surrounded by so much empty space. I mean, it's 2 hours south of Oklahoma City. It's 2 hours north of Dallas Fort Worth, maybe almost three. And so it had a lot of amenities that a city that size in Ohio wouldn't have because it was its own place. There was you were
Yeah.
so far from any other metropolitan area, and it was surrounded. But with our coverage area for a little paper of under 40,000, we covered 19 counties. I mean, we covered this gigantic terrain, and we had little freelancers all in these little counties. It wasn't just Nocona; it was like Vernon and Graham and Electra and all these little towns, that, and up into northern Oklahoma too, Frederick and Olney and stuff. Um, Interestingly, have you seen the movie Hell or High Water?
Mm.
It's set in that, and it's a very good. I love that movie. It's uh, uh, um, set in that area. Jeff Bridges and it's not Ryan Gosling. It's Chris Pine, I think, and for people who haven't seen it, I strongly recommend. It's about 3 or 4 years old, and it's a couple of young guys who start robbing banks to pay off. To get money to keep the family farm from going under,
Hmm.
and one is a skilled crook and the other is not, and he goes along to help his brother, and they're being chased by these Texas Rangers, and it's set in towns like Nocona. They're all in these little dry Texas, North Texas towns that surround Wichita Falls, and they're even there. And it was funny because when Amy and I were watching it, we were like, "Oh my God, like we've been there. That's like
Hmm.
we've been on that corner in that town because that's where we used to live." And if you want a sense of what those towns look like now and how that terrain feels, that's a very good movie. Plus, it's just a good movie anyway. So,
Okay, so I got a question for you.
all
So
right,
you've lived in, let's just pick those three. You've been in Texas, you've been in Ohio, and you've been in Florida.
yeah,
Um, you've chosen to stay in Ohio,
I have.
right? So
Despite the weather.
what's the
Um,
bigger? I mean, you got a lot of friends there, and you got roots there
yeah,
now in the
yeah.
community. But you know, if people were going to come to Dayton, what's the one thing you'd want to show them?
Take them to the Pine Club for dinner. Um, Main thing to show them, depending on their interest, maybe the Air Force Museum.
Oh,
Um,
right.
People, even little kids, like the Air Force Museum, and so if anybody in Dayton knows about it, but if you're not familiar, it's the United States. It's the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, shorthand the Air Force Museum, and it's at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the only public part of the Air Force Base that you can actually drive onto without passing through a gate. And it's 5 hangars, I think now, of all kinds of historical aircraft, dating from the Wright brothers gliders up to the modern drones and spy planes and everything in between. They
Plus, it's got
have
all the presidential
It
Air
has
Force Ones, right?
yes, all of the Air Force ones up to the last one, I think. They have the one that Kennedy was flown home in when he was killed. And they have a picture that shows you where LBJ took the oath on the plane. They have Truman's plane, the Independence. They have FDR's plane where they show you where it was modified so they could get his wheelchair up into the back of the belly. Um, I think they have all of them up through the beginning of Clinton's administration. There's like 8 of
Yeah.
them, and yeah, and but they have like a, a Japanese Zero from World War II. They have an SR-71 Blackbird spy plane. They have a stealth bomber. I mean, and you can walk right up to the B-52. I mean, it's an amazing museum. I'd probably take them there. You can spend hours there,
I
and
would
we go
say,
one
I would say it
at least
compares
once a
very,
year.
very favorably. In fact, it may even be more extensive than the Air and Space Museum in Washington. It's
Yeah,
a fantastic museum.
it is. The speaking of the Wright brothers again, the original Wright brothers airplane is in Washington. What we have here in Dayton is the Wright B Flyer, and it's at Carillon Historical Park, and it's the plane that they used to actually make a practical flying machine after the first one crashed in Kitty Hawk and they couldn't repair it. It flew 3 times, or 4 times, but it crashed and got all busted up and on the beach. So they came back to Ohio and they created the B Flyer, where they figured out pitch, roll, and yaw and all that stuff. And that's still in Dayton. Back to your point about it being the home of flight.
Right.
I would take them. I think we mostly stayed in Ohio because of family. Amy's family and my family are up here. And Jeff, maybe you and Sandy will move back someday, because when climate change happens, we'll have North Carolina's weather, and your aversion to the cold and snow will not be as big a deal as it was when you left.
So
Just
there's no
saying.
question that, we have just an incredible number of friends in Ohio. So, and it was a great place for our family, and for our kids to get raised. No question about it. So
Before we tune off, we should mention we talked about books mysteries not playing as well in Ohio as a normal state, if you will, compared to Texas and Florida. I want
in
to give a
terms of
shout
a
out to
setting,
as a setting. I want to give a shout out to 2 old series no longer being written of books, one set in Cleveland and one set in Cincinnati back in the 80s and early 90s, that I think you're familiar with at least one. There was one, the Harry Stoner novels by a writer named Jonathan Vallon, that were set in Cincinnati in the 80s and up into the mid 90s. And they are great books, hard boiled as they come. Stoner was Vallon was a great writer. I think he's still alive. I think he teaches in Cincinnati now, but he stopped the series after about 10 books, and they were all fabulous. There was a guy named Les Roberts who had a series set in Cleveland, and uh, had titles that were set around the geography of the region. The one I remember is Full Cleveland, which was back in the 80s or 70s, was like the polyester leisure suit that, and they were good books too. Not as good as the Stoner mysteries, but they were. There are a few writers who have managed to set really good mysteries in Ohio at some point during our adult lifetimes.
is it's fascinating how often Dayton shows up in movies and books as a place where people are from.
Right.
Just finished watching Inventing Anna, which is the story it's a Netflix series about Anna Sorokin, who is this Russian/German emigre who basically conned all of New York high society, and for her efforts ended up in the Who's Gal. But at one point, she's hopping out of a cab to track down her boyfriend, and there's the sign on the cab company. She's in Dayton, Ohio. And I cannot count the number of times that I'm reading a book or something,
Yep.
a Lee Child book or someone else, and suddenly, the character's mom and dad are from Dayton, Ohio. Not just Ohio, Dayton, Ohio. I think Dayton, Ohio gets mentioned more times than any other city in Ohio in those kinds of references. Now, it's possible that because I lived in Dayton for so many years, I'm more attuned to it.
Tuned to it? I don't think so. I think
But
you're right.
I think it happens a lot. And didn't at some point at the newspaper, maybe was it you or someone else at the Dayton Daily News, had something going where every time anybody spotted Dayton mentioned, either in music or a movie or a book, that you had sort of a place to publish all of that?
Yeah, we did that in the little old Seen and Overheard column in the lifestyle section, and back when I was running it. We mentioned it as often as possible. And we would do summary stories too, because it would show up in music and movies and books. Maybe a good place to wrap up today is, since people see all those comic book characters in the back, I'm going to throw a Marvel character at you, even though you're a DC guy, as we can tell from the Green Lantern in the back there. Bruce Banner, who became the Hulk when he was pissed off about something, was stationed at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base.
No,
That's
I
where he
did
did
not
his
know
work.
that.
I didn't know that either. Our friend Amelia Robinson, who was formerly a features reporter at the paper, stumbled across that in something she was reading and told me about it. And they mentioned it on Dayton.com, I think. Bruce
Was that
Banner
where
was
he was
stationed.
doing all of his gamma ray experiments that blew up and turned
Yeah,
him into the Hulk?
apparently so. Yeah.
I
Now I
did
don't know.
not know that.
I don't know how much of the storyline of the Hulk over history was set in Dayton, but there is a mention of him being stationed. And I don't know if they call it Wright-Patterson. They might call it like Wright Air Force Base or something like that. But yeah, he's basically stationed at Wright-Pat,
Well,
8
let's not
miles from
research
Orange City.
that. Yeah, let's not research that too thoroughly because it could wreck a good story. I mean, interesting if true, true if interesting. So
Well, as they used to say
let's
in the
just
Old West,
stipulate that that's the
right,
truth. Yeah,
right. When the legend is better than the truth, print the legend, as John Ford
right.
once said. So, all right. All right.
Okay,
Well, see you next time. And yeah, did you move the arm on the mannequin?
I did. I did.
Or
I had to move the mannequin because the mannequin's name is Mona. And for
right,
those of you who are listening to this podcast, we videotape it. It's on YouTube, as well as
right.
on all the various channels where podcasts are broadcast. So
Yeah.
for those of you seeing it on YouTube, behind me that Ron is referring to are a whole bunch of DC comic book characters: the Flash, Wonder Woman, Batman,
Right.
Green Lantern, and then there
Right.
is Mona, the mannequin, in her pirate outfit. She is a continuing character in the Strange Files novels that I'm pleased to assemble based on the notes Alexander Strange gives me. So
Very kind of him to do that.
he
But
is. He's a good guy.
I don't remember her arm being in that position last time. Maybe it does.
The
I'm gonna
arm
pay
that's
attention.
touching the typewriter, or the arm that's
Yeah,
holding
I
the
don't
sword?
remember. I'm gonna have to screenshot this or something and check in next time and pay attention. I'm gonna keep
Yeah.
an eye on Mona basically from now on, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
Well, I haven't really wanted to talk about this too much, Ron, and maybe it does bear mentioning, but I think that when the lights are out, Mona kind of patrols this area up here. I'm not entirely sure. Every now and then we hear funny sounds, and I'll come
She
back
kind of
up, and
moves
then the
around the
next thing you
room.
know, Mona's arms appear to have moved or something. So,
All right. Well, I'm gonna keep an eye on her. Plus, she's kind of
okay.
cute. So, all
Yeah.
right. All right. See you next
All
time.
right. Until next time, Ron. Thank you.
Be good. Bye. See ya.
Bye.